please mute to avoid unnecessary feedback? Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Audrey. Good morning to all attending the RTA's virtual meeting of the Board of Directors. The Governor's emergency declaration remains in force during the COVID-19 pandemic, and pursuant to his executive orders declaring a public health emergency and recent amendments to the Open Meetings Act, we continue to operate under the permission to conduct our meetings without our physical attendance requirements. As the head of the public body, I find it's not prudent or practical to hold an in-person meeting or to have staff or any member of the board at our headquarters during this meeting. As a reminder, closed captioning is now available for our board meetings. WebEx attendees can access closed captioning by clicking on the quote participants and selecting media viewers. So click on participants and then select media viewers if you're doing WebEx. Those watching on YouTube can simply click the CC button. So if you're on YouTube, click the CC button in the bottom right menu. Now let's review the guidelines for today's meeting. Keep your audio on mute as much as possible in order to minimize background noise, which may impair the recording. When you have a question or comment, please raise your virtual hand and Audrey will call on board members who have raised their hands one at a time. When she calls on you, lower your hand and unmute before speaking. When we get to voting, please raise your hand to make a motion or second. Audrey will identify who is making the motion and second for the record. And after she announces the motion and second, lower all hands. Are there any questions at this time? Any questions? Great. With that said, good, thank you. With that said, I'll now call this meeting of the Board of Directors of the Regional Transportation Authority to order. We'll recite, or I will recite, the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stay on mute as we normally do when we're gathered together. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Madam Secretary, will you please call our roll?
Certainly. Director Andalcio?
Yeah.
Director Canty? Director Canty?
Here.
Director Carey? Here. Director Carey? Here. Mr. Chairman, could you mute yourself? I think it's causing some feedback for me. Thank you. Director Colson?
Present.
Director Frega?
Here.
Director Fuentes?
Here.
Director Gathing?
Here.
Director Groven?
Here.
Director Holt?
Here.
Director Cotel? Director Cotel?
Here.
Director Lewis?
Present.
Director Melvin?
Here.
Director Pang?
Here.
Director Pang?
Here.
Director Ross?
Here.
Director Sager?
Here.
Chairman Dillard?
Present.
16 present.
Great. Thank you, as always, all of you, for your perfect attendance. Item 3 is the approval of the minutes from the board meeting held on January 21st of 2021. Are there any comments or corrections to these minutes? If not, could I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes as submitted?
Director Pang and Director Andalcio seconds.
Thank you, Sarah and David. Let's have a roll call, Madam Secretary, if we may.
Okay. If you could mute, Mr. Chairman. Director Andalcio?
Aye.
Director Canty,
Yes.
Director Carey,
Aye.
Director Colson,
Aye.
Director Frega,
Aye.
Director Fuentes,
Aye.
Director Gathing,
Yes.
Director Groven,
Aye.
Director Holt,
Aye.
Director Cotel,
Aye.
Director Lewis,
Aye.
Director Melvin,
Yes.
Director Pang,
Yes.
Director Ross,
Yes.
Director Sager,
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes,
16 ayes.
thank you. And the minutes are approved from January. Item 4 is the public comments segment of the meeting. We ask the public to submit their comments via electronic mail during these pandemic times. Audrey, Madam Secretary, have we received any comments to be read into the record today?
We have not received any comments.
All right, then we'll move on to item 5, which is the Executive Director's Report of Leanne Redden. Good morning, Leanne.
Helps if I unmute, right? And maybe, yes, okay, that's great. Thanks, Chairman, for muting yourself. And apologies, we seem to be getting a little extra feedback today, but that's okay. So good morning, Chairman Dillard, members of the board. In addition to what I hope is a productive discussion today about step 2 of our COVID recovery strategy, I look forward to hearing from our new RTA Transit Access Citizens Advisory Chairperson, Jackie Forbes. She is the Chief of Planning and Programming at Kane County Transportation, Department of Transportation, I should say. And she'll speak just right after I complete my report. So we're looking forward to, we actually have some new members on that board. So I think this is a great time to hear from her and help you get acquainted with her and the work that group is doing. First, I'm sure that most of you are aware on January 29th, the Centers for Disease Control issued a nationwide order requiring that masks be worn by riders and operators, I should say, of public transportation. We continue to applaud the service boards and the efforts that they are taking to ensure safe rides and a safe workplace for their staff. I'd also like to take a moment to publicly I can't speak this morning, sorry about this, maybe I need some more coffee. Publicly congratulate Jeff Nelson on his appointment as board chair of the American Public Transit Association, or APTA as we call it. You may have know Jeff or have heard of him from his service with the Illinois Public Transport Association, IPTA. He hails from Moline and he is the general manager of the Rock Island Transit District in Illinois. And for 3 decades, he has served APTA also in varying capacities. And we're really fortunate to have his national leadership during these challenging times. And just another note that I wanted to highlight, as the reason why Jeff has taken the helm of the chair of APTA is because the past chair of APTA, Nuria Fernandez, who also hails from Illinois, has moved over and is taken the helm of the Federal Transit Administration. So while Nuria most recently hailed from California, she has long Illinois roots from Peoria to Chicago. And so along with Nuria and many others in the current administration, we're very excited about the focus and the support for public transportation. So moving on to the next slide, please, state and federal legislative affairs. There's been a lot of action at the federal front, and I would be remiss in not mentioning that since we last met, the Senate confirmed Pete Buttigieg as the new Secretary of Transportation. In many previous remarks and in his confirmation testimony, Secretary Buttigieg made his commitment to transit clear. We look forward to working with him and his staff in years ahead. As I mentioned, Nuria Fernandez is also now at the helm of the FTA. So our interests, our transit interests are well represented as well in the new administration, but I also think it's really helpful that they have an Illinois perspective well covered also. Equally welcome on February 8th, the House Transportation Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure released a COVID-19 emergency relief funding package that included $30 billion for public transit nationwide. The transit proposal is part of a larger $1.9 trillion relief and stimulus package that President Biden and Democratic leaders are hoping to pass through Congress in the coming weeks through a process called budget reconciliation, which would allow the legislation to pass the Senate with a simple majority. Importantly, the stimulus package also includes $350 million for state and local relief. Early estimates suggest Illinois could receive up to $7.5 billion in relief with additional funding for Illinois municipalities. The hope is that additional state funding will mitigate some of the budget pressures on our state and lessen the need for cuts to funding that affect our transit system. We have certainly learned through this pandemic not to count our chickens before they are hatched, but regardless, I feel, and I hope you do too, that this latest movement in Congress is a strong sign that the federal government's prioritizes transit and recognizes the important role that transit must play as our nation's recovery from COVID continues. We will continue also to keep the board informed and updated as things unfold in Washington. So turning to Springfield, neither chamber of the General Assembly plans to meet in person during the month of February due to COVID precautions. So the House recently passed a resolution allowing for remote participation and voting in committees. The Senate has also previously authorized some forms of remote legislating. So therefore, both chambers intend to conduct committee business remotely throughout the next month. And yesterday, Governor Pritzker released his proposed budget for fiscal year 2022. The Governor's Office of Management and Budget has projected that the state will need to fill a $2.6 billion budget hole in FY 2022 without additional relief from the federal government. So while the proposed budget does not contain any direct tax increases, it does propose changes to the state's corporate tax structure that would result in about an estimated $932 million in additional revenue for the state. So in order to close the remainder of the budget gap, the governor's proposal reduces spending across multiple agencies and state programs, including an additional 5% reduction to the RTA's PTF funding in 22. As you probably remember, the state had already previously reduced PTF funding to the RTA by 5% in 21. The additional reduction would result in a proposed 10% decrease in PTF. And again, the hope is that the federal COVID relief funding for the state governments would alleviate the need for these additional cuts to come to fruition. And we will still continue to monitor and discuss the criticality with the state on for our transit funding with the governor's office as well as legislators in Springfield. So more to come on that. Next slide, please. Now I'll address the core of our agenda today, the continued action we take as step 2 of our 3-step recovery strategy. Last month, our staff presented an overview of analysis highlighting where it is most important that critical transit service be sustained in 21. I was heartened by our discussion and your questions and comments after that January presentation, all of which have been considered in the material that we're bringing to you today. The next step before us in step 2 of our strategy is to execute the budget and sustain critical transit services by amending our budget as needed. Today, we will be presenting information for discussion, and we will be back in March requesting your action then. So I'm grateful to tell you that the situation we find ourselves in is far more positive than it could have been several months ago, and for 3 key reasons. First, the $900 billion COVID relief package that became law December 27, known as CRISA, Congress intended that those emergency funds be used to provide operational relief to transit agencies across the country to ensure continued operations throughout 21, setting aside approximately $14 billion for transit nationwide. As a reminder, the legislation also limits funding to transit agencies when combined with the CARES Act funding to no more than 75% of its total 2018 regional operating budget. So the second point that I think we're fortunate for is that due to the relief funding cap that was specified in the CRISA law and the allocation of CARES Act funding, related to that, we've reached an agreement with our regional partners at Northwest Indiana Regional Planning Commission, or NERPC, and the entire amount of the $486.2 million coming to us under the CRISA Act will be allocated entirely within the RTA region. No funds will be split off to Indiana. So we will cover this in more detail later in the agenda when we present the proposed funding allocation recommendation. And third, I'm happy to report that the RTA sales tax receipts have been affected less by the pandemic than we had initially feared. As you saw in the board memo, and we will run through this in our presentations today, this means an additional $106 million is available to fill budget needs this year. I again want to stress our intention is that this discussion and any recommended action resulting from it will be a unique action and specific just to this moment in time, specific to these CRISA funds. These CRISA funds and this situation, I can't stress that enough, and how that relates to our step 2 recovery process. And I want to repeat, I guess, that the RTA is committed to a transparent, accountable, and collaborative process for distribution of these funds and throughout every step of our recovery. So future steps, we want to continue to have that collaborative process with our service board partners. You know, ultimately, this what we're doing here is to keep them operating the buses and trains and providing that critical transit service that we, our riders, and our region needs. We have tried to lay out that process and all the pertinent information going into this decision for you and shared it also with our stakeholders. We welcome all your questions and your feedback and your comments. So next slide, please. So looking at the timeline, a reminder of how we'll proceed from here. Today we'll discuss, as I just outlined, and you'll hear all of that from several staff. Following that meeting, the recommendations and accompanying analysis that we've already shared with you will be released publicly for comment through Friday, March 5th. At our meeting on March 18, we will ask you to consider the recommended allocation and initiate a budget amendment for the 21 operating budget. And starting in May, staff will continue to execute step 2 while initiating step 3 of our recovery planning efforts. And as you recall, step 3 is that look to, 22 and beyond, the longer term recovery from COVID. So next slide, please. The RTA has been working on an update on our Human Services Transportation Plan, which includes recommendations about how to improve the transportation system for older adults, individuals with disabilities, and low-income populations. You'll hear more about the plan at our March meeting. But before that, I would encourage everyone to attend a webinar RTA will host to discuss the plan and other ways to improve transportation access and equity across the region on Tuesday, March 9. RTA staff will be joined by our partners at MPC, the McHenry County Division of Transportation, and the National Center for Mobility Management to talk about this important topic. The link to register for this webinar is also on our RTA homepage. And next and final slide, very quickly, just to share with you the state delinquency figures for this month. Through the end of December, the state owes the RTA $188.2 million in the combination of ASA, AFA, and PTF. The state is about 7 months behind on the reimbursement match on the debt service. and equivalent of about 3.7 months behind on the public transportation fund payment. The year-to-date cost of covering that and the cost of the short-term debt that we carry is for $243,000. The final cost of short-term debt was 1.5 million for the year end 2020. And that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you. Any questions of the board for Leanne?
I see no hands.
All right, thank you, Leanne. We'll move on to item 6A, which is an update on the RTA Transit Access Citizens Advisory Board. Jackie Forbes is its new chairwoman. She comes tremendously with a great background and great resources for us. So a wonderful new chairwoman. Jackie, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, Chairman Dillard and directors. I'm Jackie Forbes, and I'm the chair of the RTA Transit Access Citizens Advisory Board, or CAB. The RTA CAB's bylaws require that the RTA CAB chairperson provide an update of their activities to the RTA board on a quarterly basis. The RTA CAB met on January 25th, 2021. In addition to the standing update about activities related to government affairs, a number of topics were highlighted at the meetings. First, RTA's Budget and Analysis Group provided a presentation on the adopted 2021 budget and the budgetary challenges that the region is facing due to the impact of COVID-19 on transit operations. In addition, to help the RTA CAB members better understand how the system is funded, an educational overview of the RTA funding structure was provided. It was an excellent presentation, I will say. Next, the Planning and Market Development Group provided an update on the progress of the RTA's ADA Paratransit Innovation Study. This study is focused on identifying innovations that can be piloted or tested to make ADA paratransit more sustainable for the long term. The study's consultant team, in cooperation with RTA staff, is completing the study's action plan and drafting a final report for the study's advisory committee. The committee will begin outreach efforts before formally presenting the study's findings to PACE. And finally, PACE will be charged with the effort of creating a pilot or pilots based on the study's recommendations to determine whether they will provide efficiencies in the system. Staff then provided a briefing on the process that is underway to update the Human Services Transportation Plan, or HSTP. The plan was last updated in 2013. The draft revamped HSTP is available on the RTA website, and board adoption of the updated HSTP will be requested at an upcoming RTA board meeting. Lastly, RTA's Director of Communications provided an overview of the structure and function of the RTA, as several RTA CAB members were recently appointed to the board. She educated the board on the structure of the RTA Board of Directors, an overview of the executive staff team, and the day-to-day responsibilities of each department. And thank you. That concludes my report.
Great, Jackie, and you are an outstanding choice to chair this important board. Are there any questions or comments or suggestions for Jackie of any of the board members?
I see no hands.
Great. So Jackie, we look forward to your quarterly reports, and it's great to have you where you're at. Thank you for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Next is item 6B, and that's the quarterly performance report for the fourth quarter of 2020. Karen Allen will brief the board. So it's great to hear from Karen. And if you don't know Karen, because she's not around or appears before us as much, check out her background. She is an amazingly qualified individual. So Karen, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for that, Chairman Dillard and board members. Good morning. My name is Karen Allen. I'm a performance analyst in the Planning and Market Development Group. Our quarterly presentations to the board always show results on a year-to-date basis. So this presentation compares performance for various metrics for the whole year 2020 to their performance in 2019. Next slide, please. We continue to use the 3 goals from Invest in Transit, our regional transit strategic plan, to structure our quarterly reports. I will walk you through each of these goals and tell you how we performed in 2020. As Jill has noted at prior quarterly presentations, I will remind you that the year 2020 included 2.5 normal months at the beginning and the 9.5 COVID impacted months. Next slide, please. The first strategic goal, deliver value on our investment, focuses on 2 key questions. Did we get more funding, and are we efficient stewards of the funds that we have? Next slide. For this goal, we monitor progress throughout 2020 by tracking capital and operating funding and expenditures and comparing performance to 2019. Looking at annual results, capital funding increased by $1.8 billion from 2019. This is the result of Rebuild Illinois bond funds getting shifted from the out years, 2021 to 2024, to 2020. Capital expenditures of $1.1 billion was a 3% increase from 2019, which we'd like to see increase in 2021. Shifting to operating performance. The system-wide operating cost per passenger trip has been significantly higher throughout 2020. Although operating costs saw a 2.3% decrease over the course of the year as some service was scaled back, this was impacted by the 58% ridership decrease, resulting in a cost per trip of $11.42. The fare revenue per passenger trip was down nearly 15% to $1.55. We don't see such a significant jump for this metric, since both parts of the equation, fare revenue and ridership, trended downward in tandem. Next slide. For the first goal spotlight, I'd like to give you an update on capital program progress with PAYGO funds, which were approved by the state as part of the Rebuild Illinois program. PAYGO funds come from the motor fuel tax and are a dedicated source of capital funding. PAYGO funding is an important part of the capital program since it's a sustainable annual capital funding resource. For the first 5 years of PAYGO, funds were split 62.5% to CTA, 32.5% to Metra, and 5% to PACE. This was based on asset conditions in the last capital asset condition report. Later this year, we will refocus on a new process for allocating these funds for the year 2025 and beyond. In the fourth quarter of 2020, PAYGO grants totaling $227 million were issued to the service boards. Work has already begun on preparing the 2021 request for PAYGO projects, and grants are expected to be issued in the second quarter of 2021. Another $227 million is expected to be granted this year. Many of the projects in the 2020 PAYGO grants focused on delivering value on investment, which includes projects that address state of good repair. DTA's major projects are focused on capital maintenance, where PAYGO funds are being used to help maintain state of good repair of CTA's assets. Similarly, many of Metra's projects focus on maintaining the current system, including maintenance on rolling stock and stations. PACE is using PAYGO funds to upgrade fare collection systems, as well as improve the customer experience by upgrading bus stops and real-time signage. PAYGO funds give the service boards a guaranteed flow of capital dollars that can be used to deliver value to riders across the region and to better maintain the system's aging assets. Next slide, please. Moving on to the second goal of Invest in Transit is build on the strengths of our network, where we ask the questions, did the region become more transit friendly, and are we focusing our limited resources wisely? Next slide. For this goal, we've been measuring vehicle revenue miles, or the amount of service available to our riders, over the past 10 years. Before the pandemic, the trend had generally been upward over the past decade. However, Metra and PACE have had reduced service plans in place since March in order to maintain operations for essential service providers, limit exposure to their frontline workers, and to reflect decreased demand on the system. Vehicle revenue miles for 2020 were 18.6% lower compared to 2019, and over the 10-year time period reflected here, down 13.7%. Next slide, please. For the second goal spotlight, we're going to look at how our region's recovery compares to other transit agencies from around the world. In early 2020, the International Association of Public Transport, or UITP, started a massive ongoing effort to collect and report public transit data from nearly 20 countries, including data from roughly 80 agencies. The RTA joined this effort last summer and continues to collaborate with UITP on a weekly basis as our service boards provide us their daily ridership numbers. This chart shows each city's year-over-year ridership comparison from September 2020 through January 2021. I've grayed out the other agencies so you can easily see where Chicago's recovery sits relative to them. Looking at the blue line, which represents the Chicagoland area, we can see that our ridership as of the end of January 2021 was 26% of what it was at the end of January 2020. Our overall recovery has been significantly lower, but smoother in comparison to our international peers. Next slide, please. The third goal is stay competitive, which asks the questions, are we providing the kind of service that people want to ride, and are people satisfied with it when they do? Next slide, please. For this goal, we've been tracking ridership as well as metrics related to speed and reliability, which can influence whether people use transit. System-wide ridership for 2020 was 230.8 million, a decrease of 58% compared to 2019. The system-wide average speed was 14.6 miles per hour, down about 2% from 2019. CTA's on-time performance averaged 82.3% for bus in 2020. Rail on-time performance was not available at this time. Metro's on-time performance averaged 96.5% in 2020, a full percentage point favorable to 2019 and exceeding their target of 95%. Pace's on-time performance averaged 83% for 2020 versus an average of 84.5% for 2019. Next slide, please. For this spotlight, we're highlighting mobility pilot projects around the region as shown on this map. These projects are collaborative efforts between RTA and partners such as Lyft, Chariot, Move It, and Via. Since 2015, RTA has been exploring last mile solutions to improve access to mainline service with a series of pilot projects. These started off with a fixed route Pace shuttle in Downers Grove, connecting the Esplanade office development, and then partnering with private mobility providers, including TNCs. The goal of these pilots was to test ways to connect people with jobs and markets that have traditionally been difficult to serve by transit. Our pilots with Lyft at Oakbrook and Bannockburn Lakes have shown value in the ease and flexibility of the on-demand nature of Lyft service in locations where demand is relatively low, as trips are made only when riders want and are without the fixed cost of traditional bus service. In fact, the COVID pandemic has shown that this is, thank you. The COVID pandemic has shown that this flexibility is resilient, with demand dropping dramatically as office workers stopped commuting. Bannockburn Lakes was still able to continue their service for the few that needed it. It is hoped that this can be a way to help build back ridership as commuting slowly returns. In Bedford Park, in partnership with Cook County and the Village, the region's first entry into MOS, or Mobility as a Service, began just before the new year, with Move It providing a trip planning and payment mobile app to provide new mobility options for a 24/7 industrial employment complex southwest of Midway Airport. Here we're offering a combination of options of Uber and Via on-demand van service, which connect with Pace, CTA, and Metro fixed route services. Our next pilots will be in partnership with Pace and Cook County to fund late night connections to mainline transit in the O'Hare South Cargo area and from the Harvey Transportation Center. These pilots are exploring alternatives that can be used by employers to improve access to their jobs. As we continue to learn about new mobility options, RTA will be disseminating information through our website and the sites of our regional partners. Next slide, please. In summary, there was a significant increase in capital funding in 2020. Work continued throughout the year and expenditure numbers improved as PAYGO grants were issued to the service boards. Ridership has not recovered as quickly as it has for agencies around the world. Mobility project partnerships may point to a way to exit low ridership seen throughout the pandemic. Thank you for your time and attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Karen. Any questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Chairman, this is Mike Lewis. I do have one comment or a question for Karen. I wondered, I know there's been a lot of construction with respect to the Amazon locations, particularly in the south suburbs. Are there any mobility plans that are designed to help facilitate transportation to and from those locations?
I am not aware of any at this time. Jill, would you be able to answer the question?
Yeah, good morning, Director Lewis. We can get you more information on that. Pace has been working with them, so we'll dig into that and report back out on that.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Excellent question, Michael. Thank you. All right. Well, Karen, thank you for a great analysis as always. And, coupled with last month's analysis and this, and Jackie Forbes is the new chairwoman of the Citizens Advisory Board. We have Karen. I am just always amazed at how great of staff and analysis that we have, both the academic backgrounds of the individuals that work for the RTA, as well as their past professional performances. So, tremendous analysis on behalf of the staff, and it's deeply, deeply appreciated and admired. Thanks, Karen, very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you.
Item 6C are the resolutions certifying the financial results for the last quarter of 2020. Good morning, B. You going to brief us on this?
Yes. Good morning. My name is B. Raina Hickey. I'm the CFO at the RTA. Good morning, members of the board as well. Today I am presenting the year-to-date financial results for the fourth quarter of 2020, which are subject to your certification. These are unaudited results compared to the amended 2020 service board budgets adopted at the December board meeting. At the end of the presentation, I will be recommending that the board certify that the operating results of the CTA Metro and Pace Suburban Service and the region as a whole are substantially in accordance with budget. Due to the unfavorable operating deficit variance and recovery ratio result, the operating financial results of ADA Paratransit are recommended to be found not in substantial accordance with the budget. Next slide, please. As you can see on this ridership slide, system ridership through December was 58.5% below prior year, but 0.9% favorable to the amended budget. The orange bars indicate that September and October produced the highest ridership results since the onset of the pandemic, followed by a second dip in November and December, coinciding with the resurgence of the virus. CTA and ADA Paratransit finished the year with favorable results to budget ridership results, while Metro Pace and Pace Suburban Service ridership results were unfavorable to the adopted budget. Next slide, please. Total operating revenue of $1.047 billion was $70.7 million, or 6.3% unfavorable to budget through the fourth quarter. With the exception of CTA, each service board reported unfavorable operating revenue compared with their amended budgets, shown in red. Most of the shortfall is due to the constraint in CARES Act requisitions, which we discussed at the last two board meetings. CTA reported additional credits in December, which applied more CARES Act funding toward operating revenue and helped mitigate the overall recovery ratio results, which will be shown later. A total of $552.8 million of federal CARES Act funding has been included in operating revenue and counted toward the service boards and recovery ratio requirements, as authorized by the May funding amendment ordinance. Next slide, please. Next, we have public funding results. Continuing the positive trend of recent months, November sales tax is projected to come in about 8% below prior year, significantly better than the budgeted 20% drop. The real estate transfer tax also outperformed the amended budget through the fourth quarter. However, CTA's total public funding results finished 3.5% unfavorable due to lower than budgeted CARES Act requisitions. Better than expected sales tax performance in 2020 should also have a favorable impact on the 2021 RTA funding to the service boards. In total, sales tax is now expected to finish 2020 about $90 million above the level anticipated in the September funding amendment. This in turn raises our expectation for 2021 sales tax by a like amount, something I will discuss in detail during the next agenda item on COVID-19 recovery strategy. Next slide, please. Looking at expenses, system-wide operating expenses through December were $48.4 million, or 1.8% favorable to budget. The service boards have continued to control expenses well, despite increased cleaning costs related to the pandemic. Service reductions at Pace Suburban Service and Metro contributed to favorable to budget variance of 8% and 2.5% respectively. Importantly, ADA Paratransit ridership has recovered faster than expected, surpassing Pace's budget assumption by 388,000 rides. This in turn has driven expense higher by $12.7 million, or 7.5% shown in red, creating an additional funding need for 2020. The ADA ridership increase has implications for 2021 ADA funding, which I will also discuss during the next agenda item. Next slide, please. When we reach year end, the budgeted net result displays at 0, reflecting the balanced service board budgets. The actual net results for each service board should also migrate to 0 after the service boards true up their CARES Act requisitions with the final 2020 sales tax results due next month. But for these unaudited results, you can see a mix of relatively small overall surpluses and deficits. The exception is ADA paratransit. The red 14.4 million is telling us that the approximate amount of additional funding needed to make the 2020 results whole due to the increased ridership I mentioned earlier. We plan to address that need with the final 2020 funding amendment at next board's meeting. Next slide, please. Looking at recovery ratios, with the CARES Act funding included, CTA's year-to-date recovery ratio of 56% finished favorable to budget by 1.2 percentage points. PACE and Metro reported unfavorable recovery ratios in excess of 3 points due to the CARES Act funding constraint caused by reduced expenses and better than expected sales tax results. ADA's paratransit recovery ratio of 9.2% was 0.8 points unfavorable and was a contributing factor to the recommended finding of not in substantial accordance with budget. The regional recovery ratio finished the year unaudited at 49.9%, or 0.8 points unfavorable to budget. Audited results may bring the recovery ratio slightly higher, but with respect to substantial accordance, staff feels that this result is close enough to 50% and thus meets the statutory requirement, especially given the extraordinary circumstances of this budget year. As you can see on the left side of the table, in the absence of the $552.8 million of CARES Act funding the service boards have recognized as fair revenue replacement, the recovery ratio would be cut to half, to 25%. Next slide, please. This looks at operating deficit. Focusing on the certification of year-to-date financial results through the fourth quarter, this slide displays the variances of each service board's operating deficit from budget. CTA and PACE Suburban Services were favorable. Metro's operating deficit was $39.1 million, or 10.5% unfavorable to budget, and this requires some explanation. While our substantial accordance guidelines would say this result is not in compliance, it is solely due to the constraint Metro ran into with respect to the amount of CARES Act funding able to be requisitioned for recovery ratio. If CARES Act funding is set aside, Metro's operating deficit would be 2% favorable to budget. And for that reason, we are recommending a substantial accordance finding for the Metro results. ADA Paratransit reported an unfavorable operating deficit of $14.4 million, or 8.9%, due to the aforementioned increased ridership and expense levels. With this unfavorable result, staff is recommending a finding of not in substantial accordance with ADA Paratransit. As we noted in the board memo, this finding was not unexpected and should not in any way reflect negatively on PACE's staff's efforts to control ADA expenses in 2020. These are unaudited results. If the audited results, once received from the service boards, differ materially, we will notify the board. Next slide, please. Since we have some new members on the board and this quarterly certification has some unusual aspects, I'd like to conclude by recapping the requirements and recommended findings. Staff uses a set of substantial accordance guidelines to evaluate each service board's operating deficit results. I won't go into this in detail today, but the guidelines do leave final determination to the judgment of the board. We have just such a situation today with the Metro result that would normally be out of compliance due solely to the CARES Act constraint I described. Similarly, the regional recovery ratio ended just shy of the 50% statutory requirement, but in staff's opinion, in substantial accordance with the budget. However, the ADA paratransit operating deficit at 9% unfavorable is outside the guideline of 2.5% and thus elicits a finding of not in substantial accordance. This concludes my remarks. I'll do my best to answer any questions. Back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, B. Any questions of B or comments?
I'm checking for hands at this time. Director Groven.
Yeah, thanks, Audrey. So B, you did a good job of explaining this, but I'm sometimes a little slow, so I just want to confirm. What you're saying is that some of the CARES Act funding was restricted because, and maybe for others, but it sounded like for Metra, their expense reductions were greater than expected. And what was the second? Oh, and the sales tax was not, was actually stronger than expected. So because of those two, I'll call them positive things, there was a restriction on the CARES Act funds available. And that leads to this, to the gap on the recovery for, at least specifically again for Metra.
That is actually correct. This is a good problem to have, and that
Right.
is why we didn't want to penalize a service board, in this case Metro, who has done more to really cut expenses due to, again, their service reductions. You know, the writers weren't there. And so we really struggled with this because years ago, we put together this set of guidance on finding service boards in substantial accordance or not, after a great deal of discussion with the board on a couple of findings where the board at the time, and this is 8 years ago or more, felt that there wasn't enough structure around that determination and more arbitrary in nature. So we put together a set of guidelines, and I want to stick with them. I mean, it's like what I have to hang my hat on, and I want to stick with those guidelines. But in this case, these are extraordinary circumstances, and it's like, why penalize someone who is actually doing the right thing? And again, if it were not for those CARES Act restrictions, in other words, you can't requisition more than your loss. So you can't enrich yourself. So that makes sense. But because of this restriction and what we budgeted for on ridership and sales tax projection, their hands were tied. So that is why in this case, we feel very strongly that they should be found in substantial accordance. Hope I explained that right.
It does, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Director Ross.
Yes, B, could you just explain to us what the steps are when an agency is found to be not in substantial compliance? What as an example with ADA paratransit?
Right. So typically what would be required is in fact an amended budget, right? And so, and we've done this before, as you know, in prior years where they were not in substantial accordance. We provide them a timeline in which to prepare an amended budget. The board reviews it, approves it, and we pass it. And then we hold them in compliance to that actual budget. The problem here is there is no more time. The year is over. We are in the final quarter. There is no way, and that is intended as a way to provide remediation, right? Some corrective actions, right the ship. There is no more time to do that for ADA paratransit because the year is over. And so at this point, we are, we had tapped into the reserves, and we'll address in the next board item how we're hoping to address their shortfall for 2020, because there is no way for them to correct it anymore. And again, I want to be clear on why ADA is above their projected ridership. As you know, there are a lot of unknowns, and so everybody's projecting ridership the best that we can, and we've all been wrong. The service boards have been wrong, we've been wrong. In ADA's case, ridership is higher than, I think this is our most needy and transit dependent population. So their ridership is actually coming back at a higher rate. And when that happens, look at it this way, where they were able to provide maybe 3 groups rides on a transport. Now they have to do single rides. So maybe 6 people were riding together. Now maybe 4 people are riding, but each of them have to be in a separate transport due to COVID, precautions and so forth. So they have to provide more transports for less people, and the people are coming in at a more increased rate than expected. So I don't know, Pace, I hope I explained that right. You're out there listening. So for those reasons, their ridership is growing at higher rate and their expenses are growing at an even higher rate.
Wouldn't it also be true that less fixed route service could result in an increased use of paratransit as well.
That could be, also look at the weather out here, right? What's going on? So who knows? I mean, people that could be writing that. I mean, this is a recent impact. I think all of those, Pace would be best able to answer some of those questions, but my opinion, unqualified opinion, is that yes, that would be impacting.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thanks, Director Ross.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I don't have my hand raising feature. I had a question for B, if I might.
Please, go ahead. Director Lewis.
B, thank you. B, the regional recovery ratio, which has always been a favorite conversation. The questions before were what happened if we didn't meet that ratio, but it was always during the interim period. This is the first time in recent memory that we're going to actually be in violation of that at the end of the reporting period. So my question is, do we ever have a chance to research what the consequences are or what the state's likely to do? Because we will not be in compliance, and the service agencies, as you correctly stated, won't have time to either readjust their budget or make up the deficit with CARES funding or the like. So just curious about that.
So a couple of things. First of all, the ADA recovery ratio is a separate item from the regional recovery ratio, and they are supposed to meet 10%. We are supposed to meet 50%. Now, we don't have final numbers. You do realize, because we actually have projections for the last 2 months. So we will have our final audited numbers in the next couple of months. So we will see what those numbers look like. The RTA Act does have language in it related to reimbursing the state for not meeting the 50% regional recovery ratio. So it is on a region. We are 0.8% short at this time. And so we would have to look at that. I will say, though, that the state still owes us a substantial amount of monies, both PTF monies, ASA and AFA. So those would all be, I think, discussions and negotiations. But I do think that this is an extraordinary year. They know that our multiple funds have been reduced. We also are still paying, the 5% on the PTF. We're paying 2.5% on the sales tax surcharge collection fee. So I think that those would warrant discussions, but I do think that if ever there was a year that we needed some leniency or some understanding on the recovery ratio and meeting that, this would be the year. So those are my, again, unqualified remarks on that. But
Can I just jump in? This is Leanne.
yes, please.
And correct me if I'm incorrect. The area where there wasn't a recovery ratio met was just on the ADA paratransit side. The regional recovery ratio requirement we are actually meeting.
At this point, we are 0.8% under it. 0.8% under the 50%.
I thought we were 0.8 over it.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, well, that's it.
So we are 0.1% under 50. We're at 49.9 for the regional recovery ratio.
Thank you, Bill.
Leanne, you agree with that?
Sorry about the confusion.
I guess I must have misinterpreted something along the way.
It's close, and it's an extraordinary time. And B, I would add that the state, if we were ever to have to speak to them, we would remind them they continue to cut our PTF funding too.
That's right. That's the 5%.
Everybody thinks we're getting more from the state, and we are from capital, and we're very grateful. But operationally, they continue to whack away at us when we're already one of the states with the least amount of operating assistance from a state government in the country. Okay, so Any other questions or comments of the board?
Yes, Director Sagar.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I just want to say thank you to B and to the entire staff. I think you just do an exceptional job of providing financial management and oversight for the RTA board. And as one member of the board, and I believe also collectively, we have a great deal of confidence in your oversight and your capacity. So your expertise is much appreciated. So I want to say thank you. I also want to express my appreciation for the frankness, because these are, to be redundant, because we've all heard this so many times and we will continue to hear about this. These are incredibly unique times, unique circumstances. And so we are having to go through some experimenting, if you will. And so while I have a great deal of appreciation for the substantial accordance guidelines of 2014, excuse me, and I think that was the most appropriate approach. We have to look at them in terms of the context of current impactors, and so I'm grateful for the qualifications that are required for doing that. You know, from a layman's perspective, you look at these and you talk about insubstantial accordance or not insubstantial accordance, and sometimes there's a mass confusion in trying to interpret all those figures in that data. I think the important element here today for us to grasp as a board is that we are looking at the aggregate of the system. So we're taking a look at the totality of all of the service agencies and the boards. And so I'm pleased with the analysis, and I'm also pleased with what the outcome is relative to what I think that we're all kind of nervously anticipating. So I want to thank you for that, and it's important for us to consider it in the aggregate.
Thank you. Yes, I think reasonableness must apply, and it is how we're interpreting that. And so I think that's the right interpretation, and we hope you'll agree.
Thanks, Dr. Sagar.
Director Pang.
Yeah, I just want to add my appreciation to Dr. Sagar's and Director Sagar's comments, but I also want to give credit to the service boards, and particularly in these difficult times, and while they're also operating and have people that are out putting their lives on the line. And so I think in this crazy world, the whole ecosystem of RTA and the service boards really have worked well together in difficult times, and that this is an appropriate action.
Thank you.
Hear, hear.
Director Ross.
I echo the comments from the other two directors. I don't think we should do any more hand-wringing over this. I think it's time to accept the staff's recommendation and move on. So I so move.
Thank you, JD. Anybody else want to chime in here, or can I have a second to Director Ross's motion?
Director Canty seconds.
Thank you, Director Canty. With that, Madam Secretary, will you please call the roll on the item 6C, certifying financial results resolutions?
Okay, Director Andalcio.
Aye.
Director Canty.
Aye.
Director Carey.
Aye.
Director Colson.
Aye.
Director Frega.
Aye.
Director Fuentes.
Aye.
Director Gathing.
Yes.
Director Groven.
Aye.
Director Holt.
Aye.
Director Cotel.
Aye.
Director Lewis.
Aye.
Director Melvin.
Yes.
Director Pang.
Yes.
Director Ross.
Aye.
Director Sagar.
Yes.
Chairman Dillard.
Yes.
16 ayes.
Thank you. And that is approved and will be so reported. Thank you very much. All right. Thanks, B. Item 6D is a report on the step 2 of our COVID-19 recovery strategy. And Jill, are you going to do this item, please?
I am. I'm going to kick it off, and then a couple other staff are going to chime in here.
Thanks.
So good morning, Chairman and members of the board. I'm here to give you another update about step 2 of the RTA COVID-19 recovery strategy. Included in your board materials were 2 items. First, a memo that included an update on RTA's recovery efforts, the status of current year funding, and proposed recommendations regarding relief fund distribution. And second, a report entitled Sustaining Critical Transit in 2021. We will cover this material in today's presentation. Next slide, please. You'll recall, and you saw this earlier, that we outlined a regional COVID-19 recovery plan last October. It consists of 3 steps. The first step is to adopt a 2021 budget that reflects the current crisis. We finished that in December. The second step is to execute the 2021 budget and make decisions as needed to sustain transit during a time of uncertainty. This step is underway now and the focus of today's presentation. The third step will be to engage in strategic recovery planning and consider how to reinvent transit. We hope to begin that in May. Next slide. In October, we also outlined a set of policy priorities to guide each step toward COVID-19 recovery. These include, first, to identify immediate funding solutions to support the transit system, including advocating for federal aid, exploring new revenue solutions, and considering how to leverage resources to meet short-term needs most effectively. Additionally, that critical transit services are sustained to provide mobility for those across the region who most need public transportation at this time, including bus riders, essential workers, residents with economic hardships, and people with disabilities. And overall, to take an increasingly transparent, collaborative approach to communicating with stakeholders and the public about projected budget shortfalls, impending cuts, and other potential disruptions to service. Next slide. Today, we will continue to focus on step 2 of the recovery process. We are going to start where we left off last month in defining transit critical need areas, or transit CNAs. We have combined all 3 options that we showed you last month into one measure, so we will show you those results. We will then give you a preview of the budget amendment that will be presented in March in an effort to fill the budget gap. And finally, we will talk more specifically about how we can apply this analysis to the allocation of this round of relief funds and our proposed recommendation. One thing I want to note and echo that Leanne said earlier is that this method that RTA has created to define transit CNAs and relate them to existing service is for the purposes of informing the RTA's funding decisions to address the 2021 budget. The application of this work to a recommended allocation of the region's additional federal relief money is unique to this moment and does not set a precedent for future allocations of any funding. Next slide. Last month, we talked about funding solutions available to us. Right now, the main solution available is the second round of emergency COVID relief funding for transit nationwide that was passed by Congress in December, known as CRISA. It will provide about $486.2 million to our region. While the estimated additional funding to the RTA region is not fully sufficient to fill the region's 2021 budget gap, we recommend that the RTA board shift focus in the near term to allocating these federal funds, as we'll discuss today. RTA staff will also continue to explore additional funding solutions as referenced in this table to bolster transit in 2021 and beyond, and bring information to the board as needed. Next slide. As discussed last month, we also recommend that the RTA board proactively state and gain regional consensus about the geographic areas in which it is critical to maintain transit presence throughout 2021 based on where transit is most likely to be used and most likely to be needed, and use this as a basis for allocating federal relief funds. Staff is going to present more detail on this proposal in a moment. Next slide. And with our third policy priority, We continue to be committed to an ongoing and open dialogue with partners, the public, and the civic community. We're putting all of this information out for public comment, and we'll share the results with you next month as you consider the budget amendment that will result from this work. I'll now turn this over to Peter Kirsten to discuss the final results of our transit CNA analysis. Next slide. Peter?
Thanks, Jill, and thanks Chairman Dillard and the board for having me here today to update the board on the staff work in defining critical need areas, which we introduced last week, or CNAs, as we're calling them, and how we're using this analysis in sustaining critical transit. Next slide, please. So recall last month we discussed 3 potential definitions for critical need areas, or CNAs. As a reminder, all 3 are looking at above average densities of worker and population demographics throughout the region. And we're focusing only on home locations, so where people live. The 3 definitions are transit propensity. So this considers who is most likely to use transit to commute before the pandemic and now. The second is regional equity. So this explores who is most likely to need transit. This is general population, not workers, but people that are truly transit dependent and need transit to access essential goods and services in our region. And then third, we looked at high mobility industries. This analysis identifies the industries that will most likely need their workers on site and in person to perform their jobs. Again, we're still looking at the worker home locations and not the job site, but we're identifying home locations of workers based on these specific types of industries. The map shown here and kind of where we arrived is the concept of the combined CNA. This encapsulates all 3 considerations in one measure, and this is the method that RTA staff recommends for defining 2021 transit CNAs. The map shows regional census tracts that compose the combined CNA. And I'll mention here again, these locations are identified because they have above average densities of these key demographic groups living within them. Next slide. So secondly, recall that we are then relating the provision of service to these CNAs. So again, we're using GTFS data here, or the data behind the transit schedule, to reflect both the presence of transit, does a train or bus stop in this census tract, and then the frequency as well. If a train or bus does stop here, how many times does it stop over the course of a week? And we're using this GTFS output from December of 2020, so it does reflect the service changes that have been implemented by Metra and PACE. The map on the left shows this distribution of regional transit. All 3 service boards are combined here. The darker the blue, the more transit there is serving that tract. Of all regional transit, 85% is operating within the combined CNAs. And then taking that 85% and proportioning it out by the individual service boards or the operators, we can see that 77.5% is CTA, 17.9% is Metra, and 4.6% is PACE. Next slide. So in summary, this chart is just repeating kind of what was on the last slide. The pie chart on the left shows that, again, 85% of regional transit is serving the combined CNA. So looking at this critical need area, 85% of our entire network, when we combine all 3 together, is already focused on the combined CNA. And then looking at just the service within that combined CNA, so kind of what we're defining as critical, all of the regional transit that serves it, the bar chart represents then the proportion by service board. So again, 77.5 to CTA, 17.9 to Metra, and 4.6 to PACE. Again, as Jill mentioned earlier, this analysis is documented more thoroughly in the Sustaining Critical Transit report that was included in the board materials and will be available for public comment. With that, I would be happy to answer any technical questions on the CNA work before turning it to the finance team to talk about the budget and the application of this work to relief funding allocations.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Great work as mentioned last month and always. Any questions or comments, Peter?
I'm checking for
material.
questions. I see no hands at this point.
Okay, thank you, Peter. This is B again. And here is some background on the overall 2021 funding outlook to keep in mind as the proposed CRRSA allocations are considered by the board. Next slide, please. I realize you hadn't. As we've discussed during the last few 2020 financial results presentations, the fall off in RTA sales tax receipts has not been as severe or sustained as it was initially feared. Early projections used in the first 2020 funding amendment assumed year-over-year monthly decreases as large as 50%. However, our largest observed decline was only 27% in April. The September funding amendment recognized this improvement and revised the 2020 sales tax forecast upward to $1.053 billion, representing a 16% decline versus 2019. The sales tax estimate was also used as the basis for forecasting the sales. Just a moment, sorry, my laptop is freezing up here. Representing a 16% decline versus 2019. The sales tax estimate was also used as a basis for forecasting the sales tax levels included in the adopted 2021 budget and 2022 to 2023 financial plan, shown as the orange bars on this slide. Recent sales tax results have continued to outperform even this most recent estimate, which in turn raises the expectations for 2021 through 2023 as shown in the blue bars. While November and December 2020 results are not yet known, sales tax is now expected to finish the year at around $1.142 billion, down approximately 9% from 2019 levels, but a significant improvement of about $90 million from the sales tax level assumed in the current 2020 budget. This increase will be recognized with the proposed final 2020 funding amendment at the March RTA board meeting. A similar improvement is also expected for 2021 through 2023. Next slide, please. The almost 2020 RTA sales tax results have improved the outlook for 2021 RTA funding levels, which include sales tax, real estate transfer tax, the RET, and the Public Transportation Fund, PTF, 30% match of sales tax, and RET provided by the state of Illinois. Relative to the funding levels included in the adopted 2021 Sales Service Board and RTA budgets, the improvements currently expected by funding component are shown in this table. These projected RTA funding increases will be refined with the latest data available prior to inclusion in the first proposed 2021 RTA funding amendment, again planned for the March board meeting. As we state in the second footnote, in order to not self-cut, we are still assuming an end to the state's 5% cut to PTF with the state fiscal year 2022 budget. If that cut is extended, these projections would decline by approximately $10 million in total. Of the $115 million projected funding increase, $106 million would go to the mainline service boards. Before we go on to the CRRSA allocation recommendations, I'd like to brief you on the ADA paratransit funding situation. Next slide, please. As I discussed earlier, ADA paratransit funding needs continue to evolve. During the financial results presentation, ADA ridership had recovered more quickly than anticipated, reaching about 60% of normal during the fourth quarter of 2020. This in turn has driven purchase transportation expense above budget, creating an additional 2020 ADA funding need of approximately $14.4 million, which is planned to be addressed with the final 2020 funding amendment in March. PACE's ADA paratransit budget developed during the summer of 2020 assumed ridership at approximately 60% of normal, a level which has already been reached and is now expected to be surpassed as COVID-19 vaccination efforts progresses. As a result, approximately $20 million of funding is expected to be needed above and beyond the $157 million of RTA and state funding allocated in the adopted 2021 budget. The RTA Act requires full funding of the ADA paratransit operating deficit. In the past, ADA paratransit funding requirement has traditionally been met using two primary sources, RTA sales tax and RTA and state ADA funding. Next slide, please. The RTA staff's recommendation for the allocation of CRRSA funding is contained in this table. Prior to allocating CRRSA funding to CTA Metro and PACE Suburban Service, it is recommended that $20 million be used to address the additional ADA funding need in 2021. Satisfying the additional ADA funding need from a source other than sales tax will preserve as much RTA operating funding as possible for the 3 mainline service boards as we move through 2021. And it will also provide a resource for meeting the 10% ADA recovery ratio in 2021. It is recommended that the remainder of the available CRRSA funding be allocated among the 3 service boards consistent with the RTA's critical need area CNA analysis. The projected RTA funding increases from the previous slide are again shown here, combined with the proposed CRRSA allocations to produce a total funding change, which will reduce or eliminate the funding shortfalls contained in the adopted CTA Metro operating budget shown in red. Now I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, B. One other thing to note is that Leanne had mentioned earlier that we reached an agreement with Northwestern Indiana, or NERPC, on the allocation of these funds. When the board materials were distributed, we had a low and a high number included in this chart. So we're happy to report that we can now show the higher of the numbers, as you see here in the CRRSA allocations row. Next slide. As part of our commitment to a transparent and collaborative communications, the materials we presented to you are available for public comment period through March 5th. We have added a new one-stop resource for RTA COVID recovery materials to our website, which can be accessed directly through our homepage. There, anyone can access the critical needs analysis report and the step 2 memo that was included in your packet. If you are aware of anyone needing help or specific accommodations to review these materials, such as translation or interpretation, please contact communications@rtachicago.org. And we will, of course, share any public comment received with you at our March meeting. Next slide. We've also created an interactive story map that visualizes the CNAs and analysis to aid in communication and understanding. You can also find that on our website COVID page, and we encourage everyone to take a look. Next slide. So in summary, this is the timeline moving forward for step 2 of the recovery for the RTA board. Today, we discussed the CNA work, funding updates, and the proposed recommendations regarding relief fund distribution. Public comment will be shared with the board members and incorporated into the final recommendations as appropriate. In March, we will ask you to consider the recommended allocation and initiate a budget amendment for the 2021 operating budget. And starting in April, staff will continue to execute on step 2 while initiating step 3. Additional details on these next steps will be presented at that time. Additionally, RTA staff has and will continue to invite collaboration and share information with our partners at each of the service boards. We look forward to working with you on this process and happy to try to answer any questions at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jill. Any questions or comments?
Director Colson?
Yeah, hello, good morning. I look at this proposal and it's good to see that ADA and CTA will be made whole. But I think as B mentioned earlier, Metro here, they did the right thing and they dramatically cut service and costs because the riders weren't there. But hopefully riders are going to start to come back. And if Metro has to add service, I think there ought to be some provision made for that. And I don't think that the fiscal restraint that they showed should be punished. Not that they're being punished, but I think it ought to be taken into account going forward. And hopefully, as riders come back, won't fare revenues go up? And have you factored maybe more fare revenues coming up in the future in all this equation? That's all.
So I'll defer to B. The fare revenues are included in the proposed budget, so that is allocated. I will just say one more time, which I probably said again, this is a moment of time that we're trying to deal with this kind of current crisis of where ridership is. As Leanne mentioned earlier in her report, that we're hopeful that other relief funding will be coming our way soon. So we're looking out to that. So I think we did this analysis to look at where we are exactly right now and to try to adjust those budget shortfalls that we're experiencing right now. And hopefully, as we move into the next step in further recovery, we'll look at other factors to address some of your very good points, Director Colson.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Director Carey?
I think since the pandemic started and ridership declined as much as it did, we have discussed many times at our board meetings over the past almost year the need to provide support for critical transit service. And I think the analysis that's been done in the CNA work is spot on. And I support what comes out of that. And I guess what you just reiterated, Jill, is just very important for us to keep in mind, because we've said this over the past year or two, is that this is a point in time, and this is not to be construed that we're not going to divide the pie differently in the future. We know that Metro ridership will come back. Will it all come back? Maybe not, but we know it will come back, tremendously this year. So we'll address that and we'll support that. But I think this addresses what we need to do right at this moment in time. Having said that, I had one question, Jill, maybe it's for B. The PTF, in here, we assume that the 5% will go away July of this year. Yet in the legislative update we had today in the budget, the state is considering proposing to increase that PTF cut to 10%. So wouldn't it make sense for us to address that in the budget?
Director Carey, we really struggle with this, and a lot of this is negotiation. And when we talk to the service boards, and we agree, we don't feel we should self-cut, right? I know it's being optimistic, and the thing about it is, at some point, you do cut, right? Because we haven't seen it in a few years. So, they have always adjusted, because we've included it the last few years, and they've had to do budget reductions and other cuts so that when they do not get it. So that's what would have to happen. Yes, if it's significantly more, maybe more proactive action. But as we've said, this is a year where we will be doing a lot of funding amendments just because of the nature of all the unknowns. And so that would be one of them. If in fact, that is the case and that's what's adopted, that will be one of them. If we didn't get the 5%, if it's further reduced, all of that. So, and other things could be affected as well. So we do know that, and they understand that, and they would have to propose a plan on how they're going to meet that reduction.
Okay, thank you.
Director Sagar?
Yes, thank you. As I indicated at the conclusion of Peter's presentation at the last board meeting, as he was going through the critical needs analysis, that I was concerned, and I share the concerns that have also been touched upon by Director Colson and Director Carey, that we don't use this data that is very, very important and has been extremely well done to change our funding formulas as we move to the future, that we don't begin to just adopt this as data that can be generalized. And so I continue to reiterate that need. I was heartened, and I appreciate very much the introductory comments by Leanne today, and then the follow-up by B in terms of the fact that the data that is being used, the approaches being taken in terms of splitting this pie right now is for those critical needs. And it is critical needs for operations today, that these are unique, and we are not intending to set precedent for future funding levels. And so I want to support this as a result of that. And I appreciate that iteration by both Leanne and B in this particular process. I think the recovery policy priorities have to be our focus today. But I also want to state very clearly that as a director representing a suburban area, that relies heavily upon Metra. I'm going to be incredibly vigilant as we move to the future in our planning efforts beyond this recovery priority establishment to date. But I do thank you for your reassurances, and I am going to concur with the recommendations that are out there for today's division of opportunity, if you will. Thank you.
I see no additional hands, so if these three directors would lower yours.
This is Mike Lewis. Unfortunately, I don't have a hand to raise. Audrey, may I speak, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Please, Michael.
Okay, thank you.
We'll get through that hand raising feature sorted out later.
My hand's probably not working very well anyway. It's a little bit cool down here in the basement. But let me just amplify some of the comments that some of the other directors made. I think that it's important to remember that this is a dynamic process, and we've committed as a board to really review this on an ongoing basis. I was encouraged by the fact that it was covering the critical needs, because as we think about how we've had to come out of this pandemic, the critical need workers and trying to make sure that transportation is assured for them is really got to be a key success factor. But long term, we'll make different decisions than we do today. But today, I think it's important for us to make the decisions that are right for the moment. And I commend B and the staff for really taking a hard look at the critical needs of our area, making sure we address those with the resources that we have, because if we don't do that, we won't get to the future. And I think it's very important. And I commend my fellow board members for taking a big picture view on this and really kind of saying, gosh, it's not what we normally receive, but certainly it's right in the moment. As we get to the next step in this process, we'll take a critical look at that and make a determination as to what makes sense. So in any event, I support it and want to support my fellow directors in their commentary as we move through these difficult times.
Director Colson, do you have another question?
No.
Your
My
hand is
hand
still
shouldn't be up.
Okay. Okay. I don't see any other hands, Mr. Chairman. Oh, sorry, Director Melvin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure can, Chris. Thank you.
Great. Sorry. There's a lot of ice on the roof here, so there's a lot of knocking and noise, so it might get a little noisy here. I just want to say very, very quickly a couple of things. We've got so many unknowns and there's so much, in some cases, so much suffering going on. But there are two things that are very clear for us here at the RTA. Got a great staff, great data, great work and communications going on. And the other great thing we've got is a board that's committed to doing the right thing with taxpayer dollars, using them most efficiently and most usefully. And I think those are things that we can really be proud of. And with that, I'll stop before the noise begins again.
Great, thank you, Director Melvin. Any other hands up, Audrey?
Nope, that will do it.
Great. Anything else, Joe, we need to add here?
No, thank you for those comments. And again, the public comment period will be open starting today, and we'll report back in the at your March meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. Federal government ought to hire you for COVID rollout and strategy, Joe. Nice job. All right. Next is item 6E as in Edward, and it's a presentation of our 2021 audit plan. And to kick it off is Nadine, our general counsel.
Good morning again, Chairman and Directors. I'm very happy to introduce Lori Newson as the RTA's new-ish Chief Auditor. Lori started her career as an auditor and most recently RTA's Director of Capital Programs, Local Planning and Program Management for 3 years prior to taking on the auditor role and joining the Legal and Compliance team last summer following Mike Zumac's departure. She's really hit the ground running these past few months, and today she will present the board with a draft of the 2021 audit plan. Without further ado, Lori Newson.
Thank you, Nadine. Let's see if this video started. 1 second here. Okay, can we see me? Okay. Thank you, Nadine. Good morning, Chairman Dillard and directors of the board. As the Chief Auditor of the RTA, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you the RTA's 2021 audit plan. Advance the slide, please. Thank you. As board members and staff of the RTA, we are expected to be good stewards of taxpayers' dollars, and audits are essential to holding ourselves accountable. Audits are objective examinations of our financial management and performance, effectiveness, and efficiency. They let us know if we are expending funds for their intended purposes, operating the agency effectively and efficiently, minimizing risk and protecting the agency's assets, adhering to internal policies, contractual obligations, laws and regulations, and they let us know if we have sound internal controls in place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. We classify, next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, stay there. I'm sorry, go back. Sorry, thank you. We classify audits into two audit types, oversight and internal. In some cases, the RTA is required to conduct audits by state and federal laws or external entities like the Federal Transit Administration and IDOT. We pass most of the grant funds received from IDOT or the federal government to the service boards or other entities providing transit service. We define these as oversight audits. For example, the region is projected to receive an unprecedented volume of capital grant funds for the state over the next several years. More grant funds mean more projects and more audit requirements. We have worked with IDOT to develop a new audit process in our efforts to effectively and efficiently administer the Rebuild Illinois program and keep priority projects moving along on budget, on time, and in accordance with state regulations, so as not to jeopardize our funding. The funding requirements approved by IDOT are similar to those and based upon those instituted by the FTA. Another example, the RTA Act requires the RTA to conduct audits of the service boards no less every 5 years to ensure management, financial, and performance are effective and efficient. Now, on the other hand, if the RTA wishes to hold itself accountable to ensure staff and management are complying with internal policies and effectively and efficiently administering our program, we conduct audits of our internal process and programs, and we call these audits internal audits. In general, the common objective of oversight and internal audits are to ensure funds received and or dispersed by the RTA are spent according to their intended purposes, and that the financial management and performance of the RTA and its grantees are compliant with grant and legal requirements and consistent with best practice. Now let's take a look at the 2021 audit plan for oversight audit. Next slide, please. The RTA will conduct a number of annual oversight audits. These generally pertain to grants made to the RTA, but pass through to the service boards. But a few grants are retained by the RTA. I will give you a moment to review the list before we go into the triennial audit of the ADA paratransit service. Next slide, please. The triennial audit of the ADA paratransit service is worth noting because it is the RTA's act that requires RTA to conduct financial compliance and performance audit of the ADA paratransit services every 3 years to assist in the determination of the projected annual cost of the ADA paratransit service. The RTA's executive director is required to provide a written determination of this amount to the board every August. This also ensures funds received by PACE from the RTA are used only to provide ADA paratransit services to individuals who are determined to be eligible for such service. Now let's look at the internal audits planned for 2020. Next slide. As depicted in this chart, We will continue to audit credit card purchases made by staff and staff reimbursements for business expenses. We will continue to ensure that the RTA, service boards, and federal grant subrecipients have their single audits in place this year. We will conduct the payroll compensation and the pension fund audits as well. So for background purposes, the payroll compensation audit reviews and evaluates the reasonableness of RTA employee salary. Reasonableness is considered up to an 8% salary increase. We also test the reasonableness of compensation to part-time employees based on the number of hours for which they are paid. Now for the pension fund, the RTA will ensure the third-party administrator and other fund service providers have sound systems of internal control that provide reasonable assurance to the RTA that the pension assets are safeguarded against loss from unauthorized use or disposition, and that transactions are executed with proper authorization and correctly reported. I will also mention we will continue to audit RTA vendors, vendor contract expenditures, and DBE compliance for contracts equal to or greater than $100,000, and submit those quarterly audit and compliance reports to the audit committee. The audit of a vendor contract ensures the entire procurement process, from solicitation to contract award, complies with the RTA internal procurement policies and all procurement laws and regulations. Additionally, we will review the amount reported to the DBE spend to make sure it aligns with the DBE goals established by the RTA at the time of the contract award. Next slide, please. This chart is a continuation of internal audit, and specifically for grants awarded to the RTA for its various planning programs and the advanced mobility. Excuse me. This is our process to officially close out these grants and ensure grant funds were expended for their intended purposes and according to the grant agreement and scope of work. And once again, this covers the grants that we receive for our various planning programs and also our enhanced mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities program, which we refer to as the 5310 program. Next slide, please. While the next two audits are rotational in nature, they are still considered internal audits because we audit our internal process. We will conduct audits on staff roles in our new ERP system and various departments' performance in protecting personally identifiable information. Before I close, I will mention that the RTA is in the process for a vendor to conduct the annual audit risk assessment. The RTA uses the results of the audit risk assessment to help prioritize the audits for the annual audit plan. So a contract could potentially come before you for approval and a revision to the proposed audit plan for quarters 3 and 4. This concludes my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lori. It's wonderful to have you in your new position. Are there questions or comments from the board?
I see Director Melvin, is your hand up for a question, or is that a leftover? Director Melvin, do you have a question?
No, I'm going to take my hand down. Sorry about that.
Okay. Then there are no questions at this time for this item.
Great, thank you. Thanks again, Lori.
Thank you.
Anything else, Nadine?
No, Chairman, that's it for my department for today.
Okay, great, thank you. Item 6F is an ordinance authorizing contracts for project management oversight, PMOs, consulting services, and Violet's going to brief the board on this item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Violet Gunka. I'm the Division Manager for Project Management Oversight. Staff is requesting that the board adopt an ordinance to execute professional services contracts with V3 companies, GSG Consultants, Transmart, and Globetrotters Engineering for a contract period of 5 years and 2 optional 1-year extensions, not to exceed $10,471,875 for all 4 contracts in total. RTA has received a capital assistance grant from the Illinois Department of Transportation for 50% of the total costs toward these contracts. 9 firms responded to the request for proposal. The selected firms will provide project management oversight, or PMO, services for projects funded by the Rebuild Illinois program. As you know, the Rebuild Illinois program provides $2.6 billion in funding for the capital program, with additional $227 million in annual pay-go funding. The consultants will work with the RTA PMO team to ensure that capital projects are being implemented according to scope, on schedule, and within budget, as well as expedite concurrence approvals. V3 companies and Globetrotters Engineering will utilize certified disadvantaged business enterprise, or DBE, firms as sub-consultants in order to meet the 20% DBE goal for contracts. GSG Consultants is a certified DBE MBE firm and will utilize all minority sub-consultants, making their team 100% DBE MBE certified, far exceeding the 20% DBE goal. Transmart is a certified DBE MBE WBE firm. It will utilize 1 DBE sub-consultant and is committed to meeting and exceeding the 20% DBE goal. Projects will be assigned to the 4 consulting firms on a rotation basis by issuing task orders, as long as there's no conflict of interest for the specific project. All 4 firms are qualified to perform PMO activities on any of the capital projects in the program. This concludes my remarks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions or comments for Violet on the 6F ordinance here?
I am scrolling for hands and do not see any.
Okay. If there aren't any, can I have a motion and a second to approve the ordinance as submitted?
Director Ross moves and Director Cotel seconds.
Thank you. With that, Madam Secretary, will you please take a roll call?
Certainly. Director Andalcio?
Yes.
Director Canty?
Aye.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director Frega?
Aye.
Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Gabbing?
Yes.
Director Groven? Director Holt?
Yes.
Director Cotel?
Aye.
Director Lewis?
Aye.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Ross?
Yes.
Director Sager?
Yes.
Chairman Dillard?
Yes.
16 ayes.
Great, thank you. And 6F, the ordinance in item 6F for PMOs is approved. Thank you. Item 7 is new business, or excuse me, item 6G is the approval of travel expense reimbursements. Any questions or comments on this one, or can there be a motion and second?
I see no questions. I have Director Sager making the motion and Director Andalcio seconding.
Thank you, gentlemen. And on 6G, Madam Secretary, please take a roll call.
Director Andalcio?
Yes.
Director Canty?
Yes.
Director Carey?
Aye.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director Frega? Director Frega?
Aye.
Director Fuentes?
Aye.
Director Groven? Director Holt?
Yes.
Director Cotel?
Aye.
Director Lewis?
Aye.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Pang?
Yes.
Director Ross?
Yes.
Director Sager?
Yes.
Chairman Dillard?
Aye.
16 ayes.
Thank you. And 6G is approved. Now item 7, and that's new business. Are there any new issues to be raised for discussion purposes only today under new business?
I'm looking for hands and I see none raised.
Okay. So as a reminder, our next scheduled meeting date for the RTA board will be on Thursday, March 18th, beginning at 9 a.m. We'll advise you of the virtual nature of the location of this meeting as we get closer because of the COVID-19 crisis, and we'll have an update then, but my guess is it'll probably still be virtual. So until then, I hope everybody stays safe and healthy and that you're all well. With that, how about an adjournment resolution or adjournment motion and second?
Director Canty makes the motion and Director Golden seconds.
Great, thank you. All those in favor of the motion can just hit the little leave button and we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.